Chapter 7 of Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 6 by John Hay and John George Nicolay. Chapter 7, Antietam. As soon as General McClellan was replaced in command of the Army of the Potomac, he began to put the forces in order, and the ease and rapidity with which this was accomplished show that both he and General Pope, with very different intentions, had equally exaggerated the state of their demoralization. The troops were not in so bad a condition at Centreville as Pope imagined, and the army that Mr. Lincoln handed over to McClellan at Washington was, both in numbers and morale, a formidable host. Its morning returns show an aggregate of over 100,000 men, and General McClellan himself reports that he had at Antietam 87,000. But the vast discrepancy between the force on paper and the effectives in battle gives a margin of which writers are apt to avail themselves according to their prejudices or prepossessions. General Palfrey, who took part in the campaign and who afterwards examined the reports on both sides with scrupulous care, says that in this single instance McClellan overstated the number of his troops in action, and that 70,000 would be nearer the mark. It is true he could afford it, as in the same estimate he very nearly doubled the number of the enemy. The Confederate rosters show some 45 brigades of infantry, exclusive of cavalry and artillery. Lee says in his report that the Battle of Antietam was fought by less than 40,000 troops on his side. McClellan's time for training and drilling his recovered army was brief, for within a few days the news came that Lee had crossed the Potomac into Maryland. There was no time now for indecision, and Lincoln's stern and constantly repeated injunction, "You must find and hurt this enemy now," had to be obeyed. General Lee has given in his own report a sufficiently clear statement of what he hoped to accomplish by his invasion of Maryland. The supplies of rich and productive districts were thus made accessible to his army, and he wished to prolong this state of affairs in every way desirable, and not to permit the season for active operations to pass without endeavoring to inflict further injury upon the enemy. He also makes an acknowledgment which shows that he, in common with others at Richmond, had been grossly deceived by the accounts which rebel refugees from Maryland and their sympathizing correspondents at home had given of the oppressive tyranny of Lincoln and the resentment it had caused in that commonwealth. He says, "The condition of Maryland encouraged the belief that the presence of our army, however inferior to that of the enemy, would induce the Washington government to retain all its available force to provide against contingencies which its course towards the people of that State gave it reason to apprehend. At the same time, it was hoped that military success might afford us an opportunity to aid the citizens of Maryland in any efforts they might be disposed to make to recover their liberties. The difficulties that surrounded them were fully appreciated, and we expected to derive more assistance in the attainment of our object from the just fears of the Washington government than from any active demonstration on the part of the people, unless success should enable us to give them assurance of continued protection." In a hasty note, he informed the Richmond government of his purpose and took the initial steps to execute it with great promptness. He crossed his entire army between the 4th and 7th of September near Leesburg and camped in the vicinity of Frederick. He took it for granted that our force at Harper's Ferry would be at once withdrawn. Thereafter he intended to move the army into Western Maryland, establish his communications with Richmond through the Shenandoah Valley, and then to move into Pennsylvania and draw McClellan from his base to fight in a field of his own selection. If all his surmises had been correct, if Miles had been withdrawn from Harper's Ferry, if Maryland had risen in revolt, if McClellan had allowed him to range through Western Maryland at his leisure, the plan would have been an admirable one, and the results of it most fruitful. But all these expectations failed. After 2 days at Frederick, he found that Maryland was contented with the oppressor's yoke, and that Miles remained at Harper's Ferry. He therefore considered it necessary to detach a large portion of his force, under Jackson, McLaws, and Walker, to surround and capture the garrison at that place. The rest of the army withdrew from Frederick to Boonesboro. Meantime, McClellan was slowly approaching. He felt, of course, the need of more troops. With an army and trains about him so enormous that, as he says in his report, they would occupy 50 miles of road in marching order, he still paused on the 10th to write to General Halleck, begging for reinforcements. He first assures him that the capital is in no danger and that all the troops there may safely be sent to him. But in order to guard against any possible rejoinder, he adds, even if Washington should be taken while these armies are confronting each other, this would not, in my judgment, bear comparison with the ruin and disaster which would follow a signal defeat of this army, an opinion which has no especial value, except as showing what General McClellan's judgment was worth in such a matter. Except when he was in Washington, he always regarded its possible capture as a trifling affair. But his demand was complied with. Porter's corps was ordered to join him with a kind message from the President, which he acknowledged courteously, and then asked for the remainder of Keyes's corps. He was in no haste. He ordered his officers beforehand to avoid collisions. He attempted in his report to account for his tardy marching on the ground that the authorities at Washington wished him not to go too far from the capital. General Halleck says that no order capable of bearing this construction was ever given. He says, "I telegraphed him that he was going too far, not from Washington, but from the Potomac. I thought he should keep more upon the Potomac and press forward his left rather than his right, so as more readily to relieve Harper's Ferry, which was the point then in most immediate danger." But 2 days after the above-mentioned letter asking for reinforcements, McClellan received information which was enough to put a soul of enterprise into the veriest laggard that ever breathed. There never was a general so fruitlessly favored by fortune as McClellan, and never was such a piece of good luck offered even to him as that which fell into his hands on the 13th of September. He had been advancing in his leisurely manner from Washington on parallel roads, making only about 6 miles a day, when on the 13th he arrived at Frederick, and one of his officers brought to him Lee's special order of the 9th that a private soldier had found, containing his entire plan of campaign. By this he learned that his enemy was before him a day's march away, that Lee's whole force was inferior to his own, and that it was divided into 2 portions, one in camp near Boonesboro and the other besieging Miles at Harper's Ferry. It is not too much to say that his enemy had been delivered into his hands. After he had read this order, an immediate contest between him and Lee, other things being equal, would have been like a fight between a man blindfolded and one having use of his eyes. He not only knew of the division of his enemy's army in half, but he knew where his trains, his rear guard, his cavalry were to march and to halt, and where the detached commands were to join the main body. He seemed to appreciate the importance of his discovery, but it was not in his nature to act promptly enough. Franklin was at Buckeystown, about 12 miles east of South Mountain, a prolongation northward of the Blue Ridge beyond which Lee's army lay. Instead of giving him immediate orders to march with all possible speed to Harper's Ferry, he wrote at his leisure a long and judicious instruction directing him to march to that point the next day. The weather was perfect, the roads were in good order. McClellan knew there was no enemy between him and Crampton's Gap. Every possible consideration urged him to make use of every instant of time. The precious opportunity was neglected, and it was noon the next day, the 14th of September, when Franklin stormed the crest of the mountain after a brilliant and easy victory over General Cobb's detachment of McLaws's division, which had been left to guard the pass. The Union right wing spent the whole of the same day in a stubborn fight for the possession of Fox's and Turner's Gaps, some 6 miles farther north. After sharp fighting, in which General Jesse L. Reno, an officer of the highest merit, was killed, and Colonel Hayes, afterwards President of the United States, was wounded, advanced positions were secured. At neither Crampton's nor Turner's was the victory pushed to advantage. Franklin did nothing to relieve the beleaguered garrison at Harper's Ferry, and the force at Turner's Gap rested on the ground that they had won until, when the mists of the morning cleared away on the 15th, they saw the enemy had retreated from their front. Much valuable time had been lost, and more than time, for early on the morning of the 15th the blundering and bewildered defence of Harper's Ferry had ceased by the surrender of the garrison, its unhappy commander having been killed after he had displayed the white flag. But McClellan had not yet lost all his advantage, and the sacrifice of Harper's Ferry would have been amply compensated if he had moved at once with all possible speed upon Lee, who, with only Longstreet's and D.H. Hill's troops, had taken up his position at Sharpsburg. Jackson was still south of the Potomac. He had no fear of night marches, and was making all possible speed to join Lee through the day and night of the 15th. The force of McLaws got away from in front of Franklin, and though making a long detour and crossing the Potomac twice, still joined the main army at Sharpsburg on the 17th. All this time, while the scattered detachments of Lee were moving with the utmost expedition to join their main body, making 2 or 3 times the distance which separated Lee from McClellan, the latter made his preparations for an attack as if, to quote Johnston again, time was of no especial value to him. On the 15th he marched down to Antietam Creek and placed his soldiers in position. He rode from end to end of his line, enjoying one of the grandest greetings ever given by an army to its commander. The thunder of cheers which met him at every point showed that there was no lack of morale in that mighty army, and that they were equal to any service their beloved commander might choose to require of them. It seems almost incredible as we write it, and it will appear inexplicable to such readers as may come after us, that McClellan made no movement during the afternoon of Monday the 15th, and did nothing during the entire day of the 16th but to advance a portion of his right wing across Antietam Creek, and this while the ragged legions of Lee were streaming in from across the Potomac to take up their positions for the impending conflict. Every minute which he thus let slip was paid for in the blood of Union soldiers next day. Never had McClellan's habit of procrastination served him so ill a turn as during the whole day of the 16th. Lee's error of dividing his army would have been fatal to him if even on the morning of the 16th McClellan had advanced upon him in force. The loss of the afternoon of the 15th in that case would scarcely have been felt. The reduction of Harper's Ferry had taken a day longer than Lee expected, and when night fell, the divisions of McLaws, Anderson, A.P. Hill, and Walker were still beyond the Potomac. He would have been compelled to withstand the attack of McClellan's whole army with nothing but the divisions of D. R. Jones and D. H. Hill on the right and center, and of Hood, Ewell, and J. R. Jones on the left. But before noon of the 17th, most of Lee's forces were on the ground, and the rest arrived during the battle. McClellan had rejected the proffered favors of fortune. His delay had given back to Lee all the advantages afforded McClellan by the separation of Lee's army and the discovery of his plan of campaign. Lee had had unbroken leisure for 48 hours to study his ground and the dispositions of his antagonists, which had been made in plain view under his eyes. Lee's advantage of position was fully equal to McClellan's advantage of numbers, and it was therefore on even terms between the two armies that the battle of Antietam began. The ground was highly favorable to Lee. In front of him was Antietam Creek, the high ground, some of it wooded, affording an advantageous position and cover for his batteries. There was little field for manoeuvring, and little was attempted. From daylight till dark of the 17th the battle went on. There was nothing of it but sheer, persistent, brutal slaughter. McClellan's plan was to throw forward his right wing, the corps of Hooker leading, supported by that of Mansfield and by those of Sumner and Franklin, if necessary. When the battle became well engaged on the right, the left wing under Burnside was to cross the lower bridge to try to turn the enemy's right. On this simple plan the battle was contested. Hooker advanced early in the morning and fought until his corps, giving and receiving about equal injuries, was shattered to pieces, and himself borne from the field, severely wounded. General Meade succeeded to the command, and Mansfield came to his assistance. The latter's corps also did heroic service, and its veteran commander was killed in the front of his foremost line. His corps was led during the rest of the day by General A.S. Williams. As the Union left remained entirely inactive, Lee was able to use most of his force on our right, and his resistance was so obstinate that Sumner's corps was drawn into the conflict, where it met with heavy losses. Richardson, one of the best division commanders in the army, received a mortal hurt, and Sedgwick was twice wounded. Before the battle ended on the right, even Franklin's corps, which McClellan had intended to hold in reserve, was drawn into the whirlpool of blood and fire. Corps by corps, division by division, one might almost say brigade by brigade, those brave and devoted troops were hurled in succession, without intelligent plan, without any special concert of action, against Lee's left. The carnage was frightful, the result in no proportion to the terrible expense. It was afternoon before the left wing under Burnside began its part of the work. The lower bridge was crossed about 1 o'clock, and the west bank gained, but no further advance was made by Burnside until after 3 o'clock. He then moved forward his forces under General Cox's command upon the enemy's right, making good progress until late in the afternoon, as if fortune, weary of having her favors rejected by General McClellan, had turned to the other side. The division of A.P. Hill, which had marched 17 miles in 7 hours, arrived on the field from Harper's Ferry and made a vigorous attack upon our extreme left, killed General Isaac P. Rodman, and threw his division into some disorder. This unlooked-for demonstration checked the advance of the Federal column, and it fell back a little distance to the hills near the Antietam. Night came on, and the long, desperate battle was at an end. The tactical advantage was with General McClellan. On his left, his center, and his right, he had gained a little ground. Both armies had suffered losses which it shocks the sense to contemplate. They were almost equal, over 12,000 killed and wounded on the Union side, over 11,000 on the Confederate. But Lee's loss was more than 1/4 of his army, while McClellan's was only 1/6 of his. In his report, General McClellan says, "The night brought with it grave responsibilities, whether to renew the attack on the 18th or to defer it, even with the risk of the enemy's retirement, was the question before me." There could be little doubt of his decision of the question. He was keenly alive to the sufferings of his army. He loved them, and was loved by them in return. The piled heaps of the slain, the thousands of wounded and dying, the wreck and havoc of the conquered field, all impressed his imagination so powerfully that he was unable to conceive the worse condition of the enemy. There rose before his mind also an appalling picture of the consequences that would ensue if he risked another battle and lost it. He saw Lee's army marching in triumph on Washington, Baltimore, Philadelphia, and New York, the country ravaged, the cause lost. Every impulse of his heart and conscience forbade him to assume so enormous a responsibility. He would not absolutely decide which course to adopt, but after his habit concluded to wait until the 19th before making a final decision. The occasion, however, would not wait for him. Lee knew, if McClellan did not, that the Confederate army was in no condition to risk another battle. The straggling of McClellan's force was one of the reasons that induced him to delay. No doubt there was a great deal of it in his command. One day Mr. Lincoln, exasperated at the discrepancy between the aggregate of troops he had sent to McClellan and the number McClellan reported as having received, exclaimed in a grotesque simile, "Sending men to that army is like shoveling fleas across a barnyard. Not half of them get there." But the case on the other side was worse still. Lee reported to Jefferson Davis on the 21st of September that the efficiency of his army was paralyzed by the loss to its ranks of the numerous stragglers. On the morning after the battle, he said, General Evans reported to me on the field where he was holding the front position that he had but 120 of his brigade present, and that the next brigade to his, that of General Garnett, consisted of but 100 men. General Pendleton reported that the brigades of Generals Lawton and Armistead, left to guard the fort at Shepherdstown, together contained but 600 men. This, he added feelingly, is a woeful condition of affairs. But of course General McClellan had no personal knowledge of this, and as we have seen in the course of this narrative, he was utterly destitute of those intuitions of the situation and the intention of his enemy which we find in all great commanders. The fight of the day before had been so terrible in the struggle and carnage, he had made his personal influence so little felt on the field, he had gained so little advantage in comparison with his frightful losses, that it would be unjust to expect to find in him on the morning of the 18th that alacrity and elation of victory which would have impelled him in pursuit of his shattered enemy. Beaten as Lee was, his promising campaign brought to a disastrous failure by his own error, he was still less affected by it than was McClellan by his victory. He even thought for the moment, before twilight had settled on the battle of the 17th, of executing with his usual instrument his usual movement, of sending Stonewall Jackson by the left to attack the right flank of McClellan's army. He opposed a bold front to his ill fortune, and closed his description of the battle by saying that he deemed it injudicious to push his advantage further. McClellan was almost alone in his decision not to continue the battle on the 18th. General Burnside, who commanded on the left, testified that he thought the attack should be renewed at early dawn, and gave this opinion to McClellan the night of the battle. General McClellan said he would think the matter over and make up his mind before morning, and a staff officer of Burnside's was kept in waiting through the night at McClellan's headquarters to learn his decision. General Franklin, in command of the center, also testified that he showed McClellan a position on our right of great importance and advised an attack on that place in the morning. He said there was no doubt that we could carry it, as we had plenty of artillery bearing on it. He thought that by this means the whole left flank of the enemy would have been uncovered. When asked what reasons were given for rejecting this plan, he repeated McClellan's customary fatal excuse for delay, that he would prefer to wait for reinforcements. Hooker, who had commanded the right wing, was also of the opinion that the attack should be resumed, although his wounds would have prevented his taking part in it. But it was too much to expect of General McClellan that he should follow such advice. He had, it is true, a moment of elation on the morning of the 15th, after the engagement at South Mountain. To attack an enemy in position and drive him was to McClellan so new a sensation that he was evidently greatly exhilarated by his success at Turner's Gap. He reported Lee as admitting they had been shockingly whipped, and as making for Shepherdstown in a perfect panic. But after the terrible conflict at Antietam, the cold fit came on, and his only dispatches to Washington were of his heavy losses and of holding what he had gained. He evidently thought more of being attacked on that day than of attacking. "The battle," he says, "will probably be renewed today. Send all the troops you can by the most expeditious route." It was therefore with feelings of the greatest relief that he saw Lee's rear guard disappear across the Potomac, and in the forenoon of the 19th he joyfully telegraphed to Washington, "Our victory was complete. The enemy is driven back into Virginia. Maryland and Pennsylvania are now safe." The President received this news, as was natural, with mingled gratitude and disappointment. He was glad and thankful for the measure of success which had been achieved, but the high hope he had entertained of destroying Lee's army before it recrossed the Potomac was baffled. His constant entreaty to McClellan, from the time he put him in command of the army up to the day of the battle, was, "Please do not let him get off without being hurt." It was with this hope and purpose that he had given McClellan everything he asked for, infusing his own indomitable spirit into all the details of work at the War Department and the headquarters of the army. It was by his order that McClellan had been pushed forward, that Porter had been detached from the defense of Washington, that the militia of Pennsylvania had been hurried down to the border. He did not share General McClellan's illusion as to the monstrous number of the enemy opposed to him, and when he looked at the vast aggregate of the Army of the Potomac by the morning report on the 20th of September, which shows 93,149 present for duty, he could not but feel that the result was not commensurate with the efforts made and the resources employed. End of chapter 7.
Chapter 8 of Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 6, by John Hay and John George Nicolay. Chapter 8, Emancipation Announced. When, on the 22nd of July, after full Cabinet discussion, President Lincoln decided to postpone the proclamation of emancipation, which he had first prepared in order to wait for a victory, all indications afforded a reasonable hope that the delay would not be a long one. The union of the armies of McClellan and Pope had been ordered, and once combined they would outnumber any force they were likely to meet. Halleck had been called to Washington to exercise chief command and secure unity of orders and movements. The new call for volunteers was expected to bring quick reinforcements. We have seen through what deplorable shortcomings of McClellan and some of his officers this reasonable hope was frustrated, and how, instead of the expected victory, an unnecessary and most disheartening defeat augmented President Lincoln's difficulties and responsibilities, how the combined armies were forced back upon Washington under such circumstances that the President felt compelled to entrust their reorganization to the very man whose weakness and jealousy had been the main cause of the disaster. The damaging effect of these reverses extended beyond mere military results. They gave a new and serious character to the political conditions and complications which were an inseparable part of the President's great task. They sharpened anew the underlying prejudice and distrust between the two factions of his supporters, radicals and conservatives, as they began to be called, or more properly speaking, those who were anxious to destroy and those who were willing to preserve slavery. Each faction loudly charged the other with being the cause of failure, and clamored vehemently for a change of policy to conform to their own views. Outside of both was the important faction of those Democrats who either yielded the war only a sullen support or opposed it as openly as they safely might, and who, on the slavery issue, directed their denunciations wholly against the radicals. It may be truly said that at no time were political questions so critical and embarrassing to Mr. Lincoln as during this period. His own decision had been reached, his own course was clearly and unalterably marked out. But the circumstances surrounding him did not permit his making it known, and he was compelled to keep up an appearance of indecision, which only brought upon him a greater flood of importunities. During no part of his administration were his acts and words so persistently misconstrued as in this interim by men who gave his words the color and meaning of their own eager desires and expectations. To interpret properly Mr. Lincoln's language, it must be constantly borne in mind that its single object was to curb and restrain the impatience of zealots from either faction. If we group together his several letters and addresses of this period, we may see that his admonitions and rebukes were given to both with equal earnestness and impartiality. Occasions were not wanting, for all request and advice which came to him were warped to one side or the other by the calumniating contest in which he alone could give the final and deciding word. On the 26th of July, 1862, he wrote the following letter to Reverdy Johnson, then at New Orleans on public business, who had made communications touching affairs in the Department of the Gulf. Yours of the 16th, by the hand of Governor Shepley, is received. It seems the Union feeling in Louisiana is being crushed out by the course of General Phelps. Please pardon me for believing that is a false pretense. The people of Louisiana, all intelligent people everywhere, know full well that I never had a wish to touch the foundations of their society or any right of theirs. With perfect knowledge of this, they forced a necessity upon me to send armies among them, and it is their own fault, not mine, that they are annoyed by the presence of General Phelps. They also know the remedy, know how to be cured of General Phelps, remove the necessity of his presence, and might it not be well for them to consider whether they have not already had time enough to do this? If they can conceive of anything worse than General Phelps within my power, would they not better be looking out for it? They very well know the way to avert all this is simply to take their place in the Union upon the old terms. If they will not do this, should they not receive harder blows rather than lighter ones? You are ready to say, I apply to friends what is due only to enemies. I distrust the wisdom, if not the sincerity, of friends who would hold my hands while my enemies stab me. This appeal of professed friends has paralyzed me more in this struggle than any other one thing. You remember telling me the day after the Baltimore mob in April, 1861, that it would crush all Union feeling in Maryland for me to attempt bringing troops over Maryland soil to Washington. I brought the troops notwithstanding, and yet there was Union feeling enough left to elect a legislature the next autumn, which in turn elected a very excellent Union United States senator. I am a patient man, always willing to forgive on the Christian terms of repentance, and also to give ample time for repentance. Still, I must save this government, if possible. What I cannot do, of course, I will not do, but it may as well be understood once for all that I shall not surrender this game, leaving any available card unplayed. 2 days later, to a citizen of Louisiana, he sent another letter full of phrases quite as positive and significant. He wrote, Mr. Durant complains that in various ways the relation of master and slave is disturbed by the presence of our army, and he considers it particularly vexatious that this in part is done under cover of an act of Congress, while constitutional guarantees are suspended on the plea of military necessity. The truth is that what is done and omitted about slaves is done and omitted on the same military necessity. It is a military necessity to have men and money, and we can get neither in sufficient numbers or amounts if we keep from or drive from our lines slaves coming to them. He speaks of no duty, apparently thinks of none, resting upon Union men. He even thinks it injurious to the Union cause that they should be restrained in trade and passage without taking sides. They are to touch neither a sail nor a pump, but to be merely passengers, deadheads at that, to be carried snug and dry throughout the storm and safely landed right side up. Nay, more, even a mutineer is to go untouched, lest these sacred passengers receive an accidental wound. Of course, the rebellion will never be suppressed in Louisiana if the professed Union men there will neither help to do it nor permit the government to do it without their help. Now, I think the true remedy is very different from what is suggested by Mr. Durant. It does not lie in rounding the rough angles of the war, but in removing the necessity for the war. If they will not do this, if they prefer to hazard all for the sake of destroying the government, it is for them to consider whether it is probable I will surrender the government to save them from losing all. If they decline what I suggest, you scarcely need to ask what I will do. What would you do in my position? Would you drop the war where it is? Or would you prosecute it in future with elder stalk squirts charged with rosewater? Would you deal lighter blows rather than heavier ones? Would you give up the contest, leaving any available means unapplied? I am in no boastful mood. I shall not do more than I can, and I shall do all I can to save the government, which is my sworn duty as well as my personal inclination. I shall do nothing in malice. What I deal with is too vast for malicious dealing. In these two letters, the President's reproof was addressed to conservatives to correct ill-timed complaints that the interests of slaveholders were allowed to suffer in the rude necessities of military operations and administration. But complaints equally unreasonable were assailing him from the other side. Mr. Greeley of the New York Tribune was criticizing the President for exactly the alleged fault of not doing more of that which had brought these complaints from Louisiana. In his paper of August 20, he addressed a long open letter to Mr. Lincoln, accusing him of failure to execute the Confiscation Act, of mistaken deference to rebel slavery, and alleging that he was unduly influenced by the counsels, the representations, the menaces of certain fossil politicians hailing from the border slave states. We complain, he continued, that a large proportion of our regular army officers, with many of the volunteers, evince far more solicitude to uphold slavery than to put down the rebellion. These phrases are samples of 2 columns or more of equally unjust censure. Mr. Lincoln always sought, and generally with success, to turn a dilemma into an advantage, and shrewdly seizing the opportunity which Mr. Greeley had created, he in turn addressed him the following open letter through the newspapers in reply, by which he not merely warded off his present personal accusation, but skillfully laid the foundation in public sentiment for the very radical step he was about to take on the slavery question. Executive Mansion, Washington, August 22, 1862. Honorable Horace Greeley. Dear Sir, I have just read yours of the 19th, addressed to myself through the New York Tribune. If there be in it any statements or assumptions of fact which I may know to be erroneous, I do not now and here controvert them. If there be in it any inferences which I may believe to be falsely drawn, I do not now and here argue against them. If there be perceptible in it an impatient and dictatorial tone, I waive it in deference to an old friend, whose heart I have always supposed to be right. As to the policy I seem to be pursuing, as you say, I have not meant to leave any one in doubt. I would save the Union. I would save it the shortest way under the Constitution. The sooner the national authority can be restored, the nearer the Union will be the Union as it was. If there be those who would not save the Union unless they could at the same time save slavery, I do not agree with them. If there be those who would not save the Union unless they could at the same time destroy slavery, I do not agree with them. My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union,
and is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps to save the Union. And what I forbear because I do not believe it would help to save the Union. I should do less whenever I shall believe what I am doing hurts the cause, and I shall do more whenever I shall believe doing more will help the cause. I shall try to correct errors when shown to be errors, and I shall adopt new views so fast as they shall appear to be true views. I have here stated my purpose according to my view of official duty, and I intend no modification of my oft-expressed personal wish that all men everywhere could be free. Yours, A. Lincoln. When Mr. Lincoln wrote the foregoing letter, the defeat of General Pope at the second battle of Bull Run had not yet taken place. On the contrary, every probability pointed to an easy victory for the Union troops in the battle which was plainly seen to be impending. We may therefore infer that he hoped soon to be able to supplement the above declarations by issuing his postponed proclamation, which would give the country knowledge of his final designs respecting the slavery question. But instead of the expected victory came a sad and demoralizing defeat, which prolonged instead of shortening the anxiety and uncertainty hanging over the intentions of the administration. Under this enforced necessity for further postponement of his fixed purpose, in addition to his many other perplexities, the President grew sensitive and even irritable upon this point. He was by nature so frank and direct, he was so conscientious in all his official responsibilities, that he made the complaints and implied reproaches of even his humblest petitioner his own. The severe impartiality of his self-judgment sometimes became almost a feeling of self-accusation, from which he found relief only by a most searching analysis of his own motives in self-justification. In the period under review, this state of feeling was several times manifested. Individuals and delegations came to him to urge one side or the other of a decision, which, though already made in his own mind, forced upon him a re-examination of its justness and its possibilities for good or evil. Imperceptibly, these mental processes became a species of self-torment, and well-meaning inquirers or advisers affected his overstrung nerves like so many persecuting inquisitors. A phlegmatic nature would have turned them away in sullen silence, or at most with an evasive commonplace, but Lincoln felt himself under compulsion, which he could not resist, to state somewhat precisely the difficulties and perplexities under which he was acting, or rather apparently refusing to act. And in such statements his public argument upon hypothesis, assumed for illustration, was liable to outrun his private conclusion upon facts which had controlled his judgment. It is in the light of this mental condition that we must judge the well-known reply made by him on the 13th of September to a deputation from the religious denominations of Chicago, requesting him to issue at once a proclamation of universal emancipation. He said, "The subject presented in the memorial is one upon which I have thought much for weeks past, and I may even say for months. I am approached with the most opposite opinions and advice, and that by religious men who are equally certain that they represent the divine will. I am sure that either the one or the other class is mistaken in that belief, and perhaps in some respects both. I hope it will not be irreverent for me to say that if it is probable that God would reveal his will to others on a point so connected with my duty, it might be supposed he would reveal it directly to me. For unless I am more deceived in myself than I often am, it is my earnest desire to know the will of Providence in this matter, and if I can learn what it is, I will do it. These are not, however, the days of miracles, and I suppose it will be granted that I am not to expect a direct revelation. I must study the plain physical facts of the case, ascertain what is possible, and learn what appears to be wise and right. What good would a proclamation of emancipation from me do, especially as we are now situated? I do not want to issue a document that the whole world will see must necessarily be inoperative, like the Pope's bull against the comet. Would my word free the slaves when I cannot even enforce the Constitution in the rebel states? Is there a single court or magistrate or individual that would be influenced by it there? And what reason is there to think it would have any greater effect upon the slaves than the late law of Congress, which I approved and which offers protection and freedom to the slaves of rebel masters who come within our lines? Yet I cannot learn that that law has caused a single slave to come over to us. Now then, tell me, if you please, what possible result of good would follow the issuing of such a proclamation as you desire. Understand, I raise no objections against it on legal or constitutional grounds, for as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy in time of war, I suppose I have a right to take any measure which may best subdue the enemy, nor do I urge objections of a moral nature in view of possible consequences of insurrection and massacre at the South. I view this matter as a practical war measure, to be decided on according to the advantages or disadvantages it may offer to the suppression of the rebellion. Do not misunderstand me because I have mentioned these objections. They indicate the difficulties that have thus far prevented my action in some such way as you desire. I have not decided against a proclamation of liberty to the slaves, but hold the matter under advisement. And I can assure you that the subject is on my mind by day and night more than any other. Whatever shall appear to be God's will, I will do. I trust that in the freedom with which I have canvassed your views, I have not in any respect injured your feelings. This interview of the Chicago delegation with the President lasted more than an hour, during which a long memorial was read, interspersed with much discursive conversation and interchange of questions and replies. The report of his remarks, which was written out and published by the delegation after their return home, is not a verbatim reproduction, but merely a condensed abstract of what was said on the occasion. Much adverse criticism has been indulged in because of his assumed declaration that an emancipation proclamation would be as inoperative as the Pope's bull against the comet, and that he nevertheless issued so preposterous a document within 2 weeks after the interview. The error lies in the assumption that his words were literally reported. To measure rightly his utterance as a whole, the conditions under which the interview occurred must continually be kept in mind. The administration and the country were still in the shadow of the great disasters of the Peninsula and of the Second Bull Run. With corresponding elation, the rebels had taken the aggressive and crossed the Potomac to invade Maryland. A new campaign was opening, and a new battle cloud was gathering. Whether victory or fresh defeat was enfolded in its gloom was a question of uncertainty and of fearful anxiety to the President, straining his thought and imagination to an abnormal and almost unendurable tension. It was at such a moment that the Chicago delegation had appeared, with a repetition of a request which seemed to him inopportune. Habitually open and patient to every appeal, he was nevertheless becoming restive under the unremitting and unreasoning pressure regarding this single point. Could no one exercise patience but himself? Could anti-slavery people not realize and rest content with the undreamed-of progress their cause had already made? Slavery abolished in the District of Columbia, the territories restored to freedom, almost wholesale emancipation provided through the Confiscation Act. Had he not aided these measures, signed these laws, ordered their enforcement? And was he not day and night laboring to secure compensated emancipation in the border states? Had he not the very proclamation they sought lying written in his desk, waiting only the favorable moment when he might announce it? Why must they push him to the wall and compel him to an avowal which might blight the ripening public sentiment and imperil the desired consummation? We may infer that with some such feelings he listened to the dogmatic memorial of the delegation, for his whole answer is in the nature of a friendly protest and polite rebuke against their impolitic urgency. And the impressive rhetorical figure he employs was not intended to foreshadow his decision, but to illustrate the absurdity of attempting to pluck the fruit before it was ripe. The great pith and point of the interview is his strong and unqualified declaration that he held the subject under advisement, and that he regarded his military authority as clear and ample. He said, "Understand, I raise no objections against it on legal or constitutional grounds, for as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy in time of war, I suppose I have a right to take any measure which may best subdue the enemy." 3 days after this interview, the Battle of Antietam was begun, which resulted in a victory for the Union forces. The events of war had abruptly changed political conditions, and the President seized the earliest possible opportunity to announce the policy which he had decided upon exactly 2 months before. His manner and language on this momentous occasion have been minutely recorded in the diaries of 2 members of the Cabinet, and liberal quotations from both will form the most valuable historical presentation of the event that can be made. The diary of Secretary Chase reads as follows: Monday, September 22, 1862. To Department, about 9. State Department messenger came with notice to heads of departments to meet at 12. Received sundry callers. Went to the White House. All the members of the Cabinet were in attendance. There was some general talk, and the President mentioned that Artemus Ward had sent him his book. Proposed to read a chapter which he thought very funny. Read it and seemed to enjoy it very much. The heads also, except Stanton, of course. The chapter was High-Handed Outrage at Utica. The President then took a graver tone and said, "Gentlemen, I have, as you are aware, thought a great deal about the relation of this war to slavery, and you all remember that several weeks ago I read to you an order I had prepared on this subject, which, on account of objections made by some of you, was not issued. Ever since then my mind has been much occupied with this subject, and I have thought all along that the time for acting on it might probably come. I think the time has come now. I wish it was a better time. I wish that we were in a better condition. The action of the army against the rebels has not been quite what I should have best liked, but they have been driven out of Maryland, and Pennsylvania is no longer in danger of invasion. When the rebel army was at Frederick, I determined, as soon as it should be driven out of Maryland, to issue a proclamation of emancipation, such as I thought most likely to be useful. I said nothing to any one, but I made the promise to myself, and, hesitating a little, to my Maker. The rebel army is now driven out, and I am going to fulfill that promise. I have got you together to hear what I have written down. I do not wish your advice about the main matter, for that I have determined for myself. This I say without intending anything but respect for any one of you. But I already know the views of each on this question. They have been heretofore expressed, and I have considered them as thoroughly and carefully as I can. What I have written is that which my reflections have determined me to say. If there is anything in the expressions I use, or in any minor matter which any one of you thinks had best be changed, I shall be glad to receive the suggestions. One other observation I will make. I know very well that many others might, in this matter, as in others, do better than I can, and if I was satisfied that the public confidence was more fully possessed by any one of them than by me, and knew of any constitutional way in which he could be put in my place, he should have it. I would gladly yield it to him. But though I believe that I have not so much of the confidence of the people as I had some time since, I do not know that, all things considered, any other person has more. And however this may be, there is no way in which I can have any other man put where I am. I am here. I must do the best I can, and bear the responsibility of taking the course which I feel I ought to take. The foregoing account, written by Mr. Chase, is fully corroborated by the following extract from the diary of Secretary Welles, in which the same event is described. September 22. A special cabinet meeting. The subject was the proclamation for emancipating the slaves after a certain date in states that shall then be in rebellion. For several weeks the subject has been suspended, but the President says never lost sight of. When it was submitted, and now in taking up the proclamation, the President stated that the question was finally decided, the act and the consequences were his, but that he felt it due to us to make us acquainted with the fact, and to invite criticisms on the paper which he had prepared. There were, he had found, not unexpectedly, some differences in the Cabinet, but he had, after ascertaining in his own way the views of each and all, individually and collectively, formed his own conclusions and made his own decisions. In the course of the discussion on this paper, which was long, earnest, and on the general principle involved harmonious, he remarked that he had made a vow, a covenant, that if God gave us the victory in the approaching battle, he would consider it an indication of divine will, and that it was duty to move forward in the cause of emancipation. It might be thought strange, he said, that he had in this way submitted the disposal of matters when the way was not clear to his mind what he should do. God had decided this question in favor of the slaves. He was satisfied it was right, was confirmed and strengthened in his action by the vow and the results. His mind was fixed, his decision made, but he wished his paper announcing his course as correct in terms as it could be made without any change in his determination. In addition to its record of the President's language, the diary of Secretary Chase proceeds with the following account of what was said by several members of the Cabinet. The President then proceeded to read his Emancipation Proclamation, making remarks on the several parts as he went on, and showing that he had fully considered the whole subject in all the lights under which it had been presented to him. After he had closed, Governor Seward said, "The general question having been decided, nothing can be said farther about that. Would it not, however, make the proclamation more clear and decided to leave out all reference to the act being sustained during the incumbency of the present President, and not merely say that the Government recognizes, but that it will maintain, the freedom it proclaims?" I followed, saying, "What you have said, Mr. President, fully satisfies me that you have given to every proposition which has been made a kind and candid consideration, and you have now expressed the conclusion to which you have arrived clearly and distinctly. This it was your right, and, under your oath of office, your duty to do. The proclamation does not, indeed, mark out exactly the course I would myself prefer, but I am ready to take it just as it is written, and to stand by it with all my heart. I think, however, the suggestions of Governor Seward very judicious, and shall be glad to have them adopted." The President then asked us severally our opinions as to the modification proposed, saying that he did not care much about the phrases he had used. Every one favored the modification, and it was adopted. Governor Seward then proposed that in the passage relating to colonization, some language should be introduced to show that the colonization proposed was to be only with the consent of the colonists and the consent of the states in which colonies might be attempted. This, too, was agreed to, and no other modification was proposed. Mr. Blair then said that, the question having been decided, he would make no objection to issuing the proclamation, but he would ask to have his paper presented some days since against the policy filed with the proclamation. The President consented to this readily, and then Mr. Blair went on to say that he was afraid of the influence of the proclamation on the border States and on the Army, and stated at some length the grounds of his apprehensions. He disclaimed most expressly, however, all objection to emancipation per se, saying he had always been personally in favor of it, always ready for immediate emancipation in the midst of slave States, rather than submit to the perpetuation of the system. The statement of Mr. Welles, which relates the Cabinet proceedings, is as follows: "All listened with profound attention to the reading, and it was, I believe, assented to by every member. Mr. Bates repeated the opinions he had previously expressed in regard to the deportation of the colored race. Mr. Seward proposed 2 slight verbal alterations, which were adopted. A general discussion then took place, covering the whole ground: the constitutional question, the war power, the expediency, and the effect of the movement. After the matter had been very fully debated, Mr. Stanton made a very emphatic speech sustaining the measure, and in closing said the act was so important and involved consequences so vast that he hoped each member would give distinctly and unequivocally his own individual opinion, whatever that opinion might be. 2 gentlemen, he thought, had not been sufficiently explicit, although they had discussed the question freely, and it was understood that they concurred in the measure. He referred, he said, to the Secretary of the Treasury, and, hesitating a moment, the Secretary of the Navy. It was understood, I believe, by all present that he had allusion to another member with whom he was not in full accord. Mr. Chase admitted that the subject had come upon him unexpectedly and with some surprise. It was going a step further than he had ever proposed, but he was prepared to accept and support it. He was glad the President had made this advance, which he should sustain from his heart, and he proceeded to make an able impromptu argument in its favor. I stated that the President did not misunderstand my position, nor any other member, that I assented most unequivocally to the measure as a war necessity, and had acted upon it. Mr. Blair took occasion to say that he was an emancipationist from principle, that he had for years, here and in Missouri, where he formerly resided, openly advocated it, but he had doubts of the expediency of this executive action at this particular juncture. We ought not, he thought, to put in jeopardy the patriotic element in the border States already severely tried. This proclamation would, as soon as it reached them, be likely to carry over those States to the secessionists. There were also party men in the free States who were striving to revive old party lines and distinctions, into whose hand we were putting a club to be used against us. The measure he approved, but the time was inopportune. He should wish, therefore, to file his objections. This, the President said, Mr. Blair could do. He had, however, considered the danger to be apprehended from the first objection mentioned, which was undoubtedly serious, but the difficulty was as great not to act as to act. There were two sides to that question. For months he had labored to get those States to move in this matter, convinced in his own mind that it was their true interest to do so, but his labors were vain. We must make the forward movement. They would acquiesce, if not immediately, soon, for they must be satisfied that slavery had received its death blow from slave owners. It could not survive the rebellion. As regarded the other objection, it had not much weight with him. Their clubs would be used against us, take what course we might. The Cabinet discussion of the proclamation being completed, Mr. Seward carried the document with him to the State Department, where the formal phraseology of attestation and the Great Seal were added. The President signed it the same afternoon, and it was published in full by the leading newspapers of the country on the morning of September 23. As elsewhere, the reading of the official announcement created a profound interest in Washington, and a serenade was organized the next evening, which came to the Executive Mansion and called on the President for a speech. His reference to the great event was very brief. He said, "I appear before you to do little more than acknowledge the courtesy you pay me and to thank you for it. I have not been distinctly informed why it is that on this occasion you appear to do me this honor, though I suppose it is because of the proclamation. What I did after a very full deliberation, and under a very heavy and solemn sense of responsibility. I can only trust in God I have made no mistake. I shall make no attempt on this occasion to sustain what I have done or said by any comment. It is now for the country and the world to pass judgment and maybe take action upon it." 2 days after the proclamation was issued, a number of the governors of loyal States met for conference at Altoona, Pennsylvania, and it was charged at the time that this occurrence had some occult relation to the President's action. There was no truth whatever in the allegation. It was directly contradicted by the President himself. He said to the Honorable George S. Boutwell, who mentioned the rumor to him a few weeks after the occurrence, "I never thought of the meeting of the governors. The truth is just this. When Lee came over the river, I made a resolution that if McClellan drove him back, I would send the proclamation after him. The battle of Antietam was fought Wednesday, and until Saturday I could not find out whether we had gained a victory or lost a battle. It was then too late to issue the proclamation that day, and the fact is I fixed it up a little Sunday, and Monday I let them have it." The collateral evidence is also conclusive on this point. The Altoona meeting originated with Governor Curtin of Pennsylvania, who, warned that Lee's army was about to cross the Potomac, was with all diligence preparing his State to resist the expected invasion. On the 6th of September, he telegraphed to the Governor of Massachusetts and others, "In the present emergency, would it not be well that the loyal governors should meet at some point in the border States to take measures for the more active support of the Government?" Receiving favorable replies, the governors of Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia united in a joint invitation, under date of September 14, for such a meeting to be held at Altoona on the 24th. The object was simply to consult on the best means of common defense and the vigorous prosecution of the war. There was no design to organize any pressure upon the President, either about the question of slavery or about the removal of McClellan from command, and the President neither anticipated nor feared such interference. Several members of the body, differing in political sentiment, indignantly denied the accusation of a political plot, which indeed would have been impossible in a gathering of men of such strong individual traits, holding diverse views and clothed with greatly varying interests and responsibilities. The proclamation of emancipation was as great a surprise to them as to the general public, gratifying some and displeasing others. It was not strange that it should immediately engage their eager interest and call out some sort of joint response. The proclamation had been printed on the 23rd. The Altoona gathering was called on the 14th and held on the 24th. Between the date of the call and the day of the meeting, the military situation was altogether changed. The Battle of Antietam had driven Lee's army in retreat back across the Potomac. Instead of emergency measures for defense, the assembled governors could now quietly discuss points of general and mutual interest relating to the recruiting, organization, equipment, and transportation of troops, the granting of furloughs, and the care and removal of the sick and wounded. Their conference passed in entire harmony, and a day or two later they nearly all proceeded to Washington for an interview with the President and the Secretary of War. They presented a written address to the President, signed then and within a few days afterwards by the governors of 16 of the free States and the governor of West Virginia, reiterating devotion to the Union, loyalty to the Constitution and laws, and earnest support to the President in suppressing rebellion, and embracing only the single specific recommendation that a reserve army of 100,000 men ought constantly to be kept on foot, to be raised, armed, equipped, and trained at home ready for emergencies. The written address also contained a hearty endorsement of the new emancipation policy announced in the President's proclamation. This declaration, as was to have been expected, developed the only antagonism of views which grew out of the whole transaction. The address was written at Washington, and therefore was not discussed at Altoona. Properly speaking, it was the supplementary action of only a portion of the assembled delegates. It was, however, transmitted for signature to all the loyal executives, but the governors of the States of New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri replied that while concurring in the other declarations of the address, they declined signing it because they dissented from that portion of it which endorsed the proclamation of emancipation. Coming as it did immediately after the announcement of his new policy, President Lincoln could not but be gratified at the public declaration emanating from the Altoona meeting. On his military policy, it assured him of the continuation of a unanimous official support. On his emancipation policy, it gave him a public approval from the official power of 17 States, as against the dissent of only 5 States of the border, where indeed he had no reason to expect, for the present at least, any more favorable official sentiment. Nevertheless, it did not free the experiment from uncertainty and danger. It was precisely this balance of power, political and military, wielded by these hesitating border States, which was essential to the success of the Union cause. But he had measured the probability with an acuteness of judgment, and timed his proceeding with a prudence of action that merited success, and in due time triumphantly justified his faith. Every thoughtful reader will have more than a passing curiosity to examine the exact phraseology of a document which ushered in the great political regeneration of the American people. It reads as follows: I, Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States of America, and Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy thereof, do hereby proclaim and declare that hereafter, as heretofore, the war will be prosecuted for the object of practically restoring the constitutional relations between the United States and each of the States and the people thereof, in which States that relation is or may be suspended or disturbed. that it is my purpose, upon the next meeting of Congress, to again recommend the adoption of a practical measure tendering pecuniary aid to the free acceptance or rejection of all the slave states, so called, the people whereof may not then be in rebellion against the United States, and which states may then have voluntarily adopted, or thereafter may voluntarily adopt, the immediate or gradual abolishment of slavery within their respective limits, and that the effort to colonize persons of African descent with their consent upon this continent or elsewhere, with the previously obtained consent of the governments existing there, will be continued. That on the first day of January in the year of our Lord 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state, or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be then thenceforward and forever free. And the executive government of the United States, including the military and naval authorities thereof, will recognize and maintain the freedom of such persons, and will do no act or acts to repress such persons, or any of them, in any efforts they may make for their actual freedom. That the executive will, on the first day of January aforesaid, by proclamation designate the states or parts of states, if any, in which the people thereof respectively shall then be in rebellion against the United States, and the fact that any state or the people thereof shall on that day be in good faith represented in the Congress of the United States by members chosen thereto at elections, wherein a majority of the qualified voters of such states shall have participated, shall, in the absence of strong countervailing testimony, be deemed conclusive evidence that such state and the people thereof are not then in rebellion against the United States. Then, after reciting the language of an act to make an additional article of war, approved March 13, 1862, and also sections 9 and 10 of the Confiscation Act, approved July 17, 1862, and enjoining their enforcement upon all persons in the military and naval service, the proclamation concludes: And I do hereby enjoin upon and order all persons engaged in the military and naval service of the United States to observe, obey, and enforce within their respective spheres of service the acts and sections above recited. And the Executive will, in due time, recommend that all citizens of the United States who shall have remained loyal thereto throughout the rebellion shall, upon the restoration of the constitutional relations between the United States and the people, if that relation shall have been suspended or disturbed, be compensated for all losses by acts of the United States, including the loss of slaves. A careful reading and analysis of the document shows it to have contained 4 leading propositions: 1. A renewal of the plan of compensated abolishment; 2. A continuance of the effort at voluntary colonization; 3. The announcement of peremptory military emancipation of all slaves in states in rebellion at the expiration of the warning notice; 4. A promise to recommend ultimate compensation to loyal owners. The political test of the experiment of military emancipation, thus announced by the President, came almost immediately in the autumn elections for State officers and State legislatures, and especially for representatives to the 38th Congress. The decided failure of McClellan's Richmond campaign and the inaction of the Western Army had already produced much popular discontent, which was only partly relieved by the victory of Antietam. The canvass had been inaugurated by the Democratic party with violent protests against the anti-slavery legislation of Congress, and it now added the loud outcry that the administration had changed the war for the Union to a war for abolition. The party conflict became active and bitter, and the Democrats, having all the advantage of an aggressive issue, made great popular gains, not only throughout the middle belts of States, but in New York, where they elected their governor, thus gaining control of the executive machinery, which greatly embarrassed the administration in its later measures to maintain the army. The number of Democrats in the House of Representatives was increased from 44 to 75, and the reaction threatened for a time to deprive Mr. Lincoln of the support of the House. But against this temporary adverse political current, the leaders of the bulk of the Republican party followed Mr. Lincoln with loyal adhesion, accepting and defending his emancipation policy with earnestness and enthusiasm. In his annual message of December 1, 1862, the President did not discuss his Emancipation Proclamation, but renewed and made an elaborate argument to recommend his plan of compensated abolishment, not an exclusion of, but additional to all others, for restoring and preserving the national authority throughout the Union. Meanwhile, the Democratic minority in the House, joined by the pro-slavery conservatives from the border slave States, lost no opportunity to oppose emancipation in every form. On the 11th of December, Representative George H. Yeaman of Kentucky offered resolutions declaring the President's proclamation unwarranted by the Constitution and a useless and dangerous war measure. But these propositions were only supported by a vote of 45, while they were promptly laid on the table by a vote of 94 members. The Republicans were unwilling to remain in this attitude of giving emancipation a merely negative support. A few days later, December 15, Representative S.C. Fessenden of Maine put the identical phraseology in an affirmative form, and by a test vote of 78 to 51, the House resolved that the proclamation of the President of the United States of the date of 22nd September 1862 is warranted by the Constitution, and that the policy of emancipation, as indicated in that proclamation, is well adapted to hasten the restoration of peace, was well chosen as a war measure, and is an exercise of power with proper regard for the rights of the States and the perpetuity of free government. With the proclamation thus heartily endorsed by nearly every free State governor and nearly two-thirds of the loyal representatives, Mr. Lincoln, who had accurately foreseen the danger as well as the benefits of the critical step he had taken, could well afford to wait for the full tide of approval, for which he looked with confidence, and which came to him from that time onward with steadiness and ever-growing volume, both from the armies in the field and the people in their homes throughout the loyal North. End of chapter 8. Chapter 9 of Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 6, by John Hay and John George Nicolay. Chapter 9, The Removal of McClellan. The latter part of September wore away in resting the exhausted Army of the Potomac and beginning anew the endless work of equipment and supply, work which from the nature of the case can never be finished in an army of 200,000, any more than in a city of the same size. But this was a lesson which McClellan appeared never able to learn. So long as a single brigade commander complained that some of his men needed new shoes, it seemed impossible for him to undertake active operations until that special want was supplied. When that was done, some company of cavalry was short a few horses, and the vicious circle of importunate demand and slow supply continued forever. On the 23rd of September, General McClellan discovered symptoms of heavy reinforcements moving towards the enemy from Winchester and Charlestown. The fact of the enemy remaining so long in his front, instead of appearing to him as a renewed opportunity, only excited in him the apprehension that he would be again attacked. He therefore set up a new clamor for reinforcements. A defeat at this juncture would be ruinous to our cause. General Sumner, with his corps and Williams's, Banks's, occupy Harper's Ferry and the surrounding heights. I think, is the doleful plaint with which the dispatch closes, he will be able to hold his position till reinforcements arrive. 4 days afterwards he writes again in the same strain: "This army is not now in condition to undertake another campaign. My present purpose is to hold the army about as it is now, rendering Harper's Ferry secure and watching the river closely, intending to attack the enemy should he attempt to cross to this side. He is full of apprehension in regard to an attack upon Maryland, and prays that the river may rise so that the enemy may not cross." The President, sick at heart at this delay, resolved at the end of the month to make a visit to McClellan's camp to see if in a personal interview he could not inspire him with some sense of the necessity of action. The morning report of the 30th of September showed the enormous aggregate of the Army of the Potomac present and absent, including Banks's command in Washington of 303,959. Of this, 1,756 were absent, 28,458 on special duty, and 73,601 present for duty in Banks's command, leaving 100,144 men present for duty under McClellan's immediate command. This vast multitude in arms was visited by the President in the first days of October. So far as he could see, it was a great army ready for any work that could be asked of it. During all his visit, he urged, with as much energy as was consistent with his habitual courtesy, the necessity of an immediate employment of this force. McClellan met all his suggestions and entreaties with an amiable inertia, which deeply discouraged the President. After a day and a night spent in such an interchange of views, he left his tent early in the morning and walked with a friend to an eminence which commanded a view of a great part of the camp. For miles beneath them spread the white tents of the mighty hosts glistening in the rising sun. Mr. Lincoln gazed for a while in silence upon the scene, then turned to his friend and said, "Do you know what this is?" He answered in some astonishment, "It is the Army of the Potomac." "So it is called," responded the President, "but that is a mistake. It is only McClellan's bodyguard." He went back to Washington, taking little comfort from his visit, and after a few days of painful deliberation, getting no news of any movement, he sent McClellan the following positive instructions: Washington, D.C., October 6, 1862. Major General McClellan, I am instructed to telegraph you as follows. The President directs that you cross the Potomac and give battle to the enemy, or drive him south. Your army must move now while the roads are good. If you cross the river between the enemy and Washington and cover the latter by your operation, you can be reinforced with 30,000 men. If you move up the valley of the Shenandoah, not more than 12,000 or 15,000 can be sent to you. The President advises the interior line between Washington and the enemy, but does not order it. He is very desirous that your army move as soon as possible. You will immediately report what line you adopt and when you intend to cross the river. Also, to what point the reinforcements are to be sent. It is necessary that the plan of your operations be positively determined on before orders are given for building bridges and repairing railroads. I am directed to add that the Secretary of War and the General-in-Chief fully concur with the President in these instructions. H. W. Halleck, General-in-Chief. These orders were emphasized a few days later by a repetition of the same stinging insult which Lee had once before inflicted upon McClellan on the Peninsula. Stewart's cavalry crossed the Potomac, rode entirely around the Union army, recrossing the river lower down and joining Lee again without damage. McClellan seems to have felt no mortification from this disgraceful occurrence, which he used merely as a pretext for new complaints against the government. He seemed to think that he had presented a satisfactory excuse for his inefficiency when he reported to Halleck that his cavalry had marched 78 miles in 24 hours, while Stewart's was marching 90. He pretended that he had at the time only 1,000 cavalry. This led to a remarkable correspondence between him and the government, which shows the waste and destruction of military material under McClellan. By the reports from the Quartermaster General's office, there were sent to the Army of the Potomac during the 6 weeks ending October 14th 10,254 horses and a very large number of mules. The cost of the horses issued within the last 6 weeks to the Army of the Potomac, says General Meigs, is probably not less than $1,200,000. We may well ask, in the words used by the Quartermaster General in another place, Is there an instance on record of such a drain and destruction of horses in a country not a desert? Day after day the tedious controversy went on. This frightful waste of horses was turned by McClellan, as he turned everything, into a subject of reproach against the government. To one of his complaining dispatches the President sent this sharp rejoinder: "Will you pardon me for asking what the horses of your army have done since the battle of Antietam that fatigues anything?" And again, Stuart's cavalry outmarched ours, having certainly done more marked service on the Peninsula and everywhere since. These dispatches elicited only new complaints, vindications, and explanations. It was not alone the pretended lack of horses which kept him idle. In his dispatches to Washington he continually complained, and the complaint was echoed by his adherents, that the army was unable to improve the fine weather on account of the deficiency of all manner of supplies. The Secretary of War, thinking it necessary at last to take notice of this widespread rumor, addressed a letter to the General-in-Chief demanding a report upon the subject. General Halleck reported that on several occasions, when General McClellan had telegraphed that his army was deficient in certain supplies, it was ascertained that in every instance the requisition had been immediately filled, except in one, where the Quartermaster General was forced to send to Philadelphia for the articles needed. He reported that there had been no neglect or delay in issuing all the supplies asked for, and added his belief that no armies in the world, while in campaign, have been more promptly or better supplied than ours. The General-in-Chief further reported that there had been no such want of supplies as to prevent General McClellan's compliance with the orders issued 4 weeks before to advance against the enemy; that had he moved to the south side of the Potomac, he could have received his supplies almost as readily as by remaining inactive on the north side. He then goes at some length into a detailed and categorical contradiction of General McClellan's complaining dispatches, but we need not go outside of the general's own staff for a direct denial of his accusations. General Rufus Ingalls, the chief quartermaster of the Army of the Potomac, makes this just and sensible statement in a letter to the Quartermaster General dated the 26th of October. I have seen no real suffering for want of clothing, and do not believe there has been any, only where it can be laid directly to the charge of regimental and brigade commanders and their quartermasters, and I have labored, I hope with some effect, in trying to instruct them. I have frequently remarked that an army will never move if it waits until all the different commanders report that they are ready and want no more supplies. It has been my pride to know the fact that no army was ever more perfectly supplied than this has been as a general rule. The President, weary of the controversy, at last replied: "Most certainly I intend no injustice to any, and if I have done any, I deeply regret it. To be told, after more than 5 weeks' total inaction of the army, and during which period we have sent to the army every fresh horse we possibly could, amounting in the whole to 7,918, that the cavalry horses were too much fatigued to move, presents a very cheerless, almost hopeless prospect for the future, and it may have forced something of impatience in my dispatch. If not recruited and rested, then when could they ever be?" General Halleck, in a letter of the 7th of October, had urged McClellan to follow and seek to punish the enemy. He said, "There is a decided want of legs in our troops. They have too much immobility, and we must try to remedy the defect. A reduction of baggage and baggage trains will effect something. But the real difficulty is they are not sufficiently exercised in marching. They lie still in camp too long. After a hard march, 1 day is time enough to rest. Lying still beyond that time does not rest the men." The President's proclamation of emancipation had been promulgated to the Army in general orders on the 24th of September. It will be remembered that General McClellan, in his manifesto from Harrison's Landing, had admonished the President against any such action. His subsequent negotiations with the Democratic politicians in the North had not tended to make him any more favorably disposed towards such radical action. His first impulse was to range himself openly against the proclamation. We are informed by General W. F. Smith that McClellan prepared a protest against it, which he read to some of his intimate friends in the army. The advice of Smith, and perhaps others, induced him not to commit so fatal a breach of discipline. For a moment he thought of throwing up his commission. In a private letter of September 25, he said, "The President's late proclamation, the continuation of Stanton and Halleck in office, render it almost impossible for me to retain my commission and self-respect at the same time." He could not, however, pass over with entire silence an order of such momentous importance, and so, after 2 weeks of meditation, having heard from his friends in New York, he issued on the 7th of October a singular document calling the attention of the officers and soldiers of his army to the President's proclamation. He made absolutely no reference to the proclamation itself. He used it, as he says, simply as an opportunity of defining the relation borne by all persons in the military service toward the civil authorities, a relation which most of his army understood already at least as well as himself. In a few commonplace phrases, he restates the political axiom that the civil authority is paramount in our government and that the military is subordinate to it. He therefore deprecated any intemperate discussion of public measures determined upon and declared by the government as tending to impair and destroy the discipline and efficiency of troops, and significantly adds, the remedy for political errors, if any are committed, is to be found only in the action of the people at the polls. There is no reason to believe that this order of General McClellan's was issued with any but the best intentions. He believed, and he thought the army believed, the President's anti-slavery policy was ill-advised and might prove disastrous. He therefore issued this order, commanding his soldiers to be moderate in their criticisms and condemnation of the President, and to leave to the people at the polls the work of correcting or punishing him. When the troops of the Army of the Potomac had an opportunity of expressing at the polls their sense of the political question at issue between Lincoln and McClellan, the general had occasion to discover that there was a difference between the sentiment of staff headquarters and the sentiment of the rank and file. The President's peremptory order to move, which we have mentioned as having been issued on the 7th of October, having produced no effect, he wrote to General McClellan on the 13th of the month a letter so important in its substance and in its relations to subsequent events that it must be printed entire. Having already given the general his orders and told him what to do, he now not only tells him how to do it, but furnishes him unanswerable reasons why it should be done. My dear sir, you remember my speaking to you of what I called your over-cautiousness. Are you not over-cautious when you assume that you cannot do what the enemy is constantly doing? Should you not claim to be at least his equal in prowess, and act upon the claim? As I understand, you telegraphed General Halleck that you cannot subsist your army at Winchester unless the railroad from Harper's Ferry to that point be put in working order. But the enemy does now subsist his army at Winchester at a distance nearly twice as great from railroad transportation as you would have to do without the railroad last named. He now wagons from Culpeper Courthouse, which is just about twice as far as you would have to do from Harper's Ferry. He is certainly not more than half as well provided with wagons as you are. I certainly should be pleased for you to have the advantage of the railroad from Harper's Ferry to Winchester, but it wastes all the remainder of autumn to give it to you, and in fact ignores the question of time, which cannot and must not be ignored. Again, one of the standard maxims of war, as you know, is to operate upon the enemy's communications as much as possible without exposing your own. You seem to act as if this applies against you, but cannot apply in your favor. Change positions with the enemy, and think you not he would break your communication with Richmond within the next 24 hours? You dread his going into Pennsylvania, but if he does so in full force, he gives up his communications to you absolutely. and you have nothing to do but to follow and ruin him. If he does so with less than full force, fall upon him, beat what is left behind all the easier. Exclusive of the water line, you are now nearer Richmond than the enemy is by the route that you can and he must take. Why can you not reach there before him, unless you admit that he is more than your equal on a march? His route is the arc of a circle, while yours is the chord. The roads are as good on yours as on his. You know I desired, but did not order you to cross the Potomac below instead of above the Shenandoah and Blue Ridge. My idea was that this would at once menace the enemy's communications, which I would seize if he would permit. If he should move northward, I would follow him closely, holding his communications. If he should prevent our seizing his communications and move toward Richmond, I would press closely to him, fight him if a favorable opportunity should present, and at least try to beat him to Richmond on the inside track. I say try. If we never try, we shall never succeed. If he makes a stand at Winchester, moving neither north nor south, I would fight him there, on the idea that if we cannot beat him when he bears the wastage of coming to us, we never can when we bear the wastage of going to him. This proposition is a simple truth, and is too important to be lost sight of for a moment. In coming to us, he tenders us an advantage which we should not waive. We should not so operate as to merely drive him away. As we must beat him somewhere, or fail finally, we can do it, if at all, easier near to us than far away. If we cannot beat the enemy where he now is, we never can, he again being within the entrenchments of Richmond. Recurring to the idea of going to Richmond on the inside track, the facility of supplying from the side away from the enemy is remarkable, as it were, by the different spokes of a wheel, extending from the hub toward the rim, and this, whether you move directly by the chord or on the inside arc, hugging the Blue Ridge more closely. The chord line, as you see, carries you by Aldie, Haymarket, and Fredericksburg, and you see how turnpikes, railroads, and finally the Potomac by Aquia Creek meet you at all points from Washington. The same, only the lines lengthened a little if you press closer to the Blue Ridge part of the way. The gaps through the Blue Ridge I understand to be about the following distances from Harper's Ferry, to wit: Vestal's 5 miles, Gregory's 13, Snicker's 18, Ashby's 28, Manassas 38, Chester 45, and Thornton's 53. I should think it preferable to take the route nearest the enemy, disabling him to make an important move without your knowledge, and compelling him to keep his forces together for dread of you. The gaps would enable you to attack if you should wish. For a great part of the way you would be practically between the enemy and both Washington and Richmond, enabling us to spare you the greatest number of troops from here. When at length running for Richmond ahead of him enables him to move this way, if he does so, turn and attack him in the rear. But I think he should be engaged long before such point is reached. It is all easy if our troops march as well as the enemy, and it is unmanly to say they cannot do it. This letter is in no sense an order. Yours truly, A. Lincoln. In the absence of any definite plan or purpose of his own, General McClellan accepted this plan of the President's, giving in his report a characteristic reason, that it would secure me the largest accession of force. But even after he adopted this decision, the usual delays supervened, and on the 21st, after describing the wretched condition of his cavalry, he asked whether the President desired him to march on the enemy at once, or to await the reception of the new horses, to which, on the same day, the President directed the General-in-Chief to send the following reply: Your telegram of 12 M. has been submitted to the President. He directs me to say that he has no change to make in his order of the 6th instant. If you have not been and are not now in condition to obey it, you will be able to show such want of ability. The President does not expect impossibilities, but he is very anxious that all this good weather should not be wasted in inactivity. Telegraph when you will move and on what lines you propose to march. With the exercise of a very little sagacity, General McClellan should have discovered from the tone of this dispatch that the President's mood was taking on a certain tinge of austerity. Nevertheless, he continued his preparations at perfect leisure, and 4 days afterwards he sent a long letter asking for definite instructions in regard to the details of guards to be left on the upper Potomac, to which he received a reply saying, "The Government has entrusted you with defeating and driving back the rebel army in your front," and directing him to use his own discretion as to the matters in question. As General McClellan in his dispatch had referred with some apprehension to the probable march of Bragg's army eastward, General Halleck concluded his answer with this significant intimation: "You are within 20 miles of Lee, while Bragg is distant about 400 miles." He finally got his army across the Potomac on the 1st of November. It had begun crossing on the 26th of October, and the several detachments, as they arrived in Virginia, were slowly distributed on the eastern slope of the Blue Ridge under the vigilant and now distrustful eye of the President. There is no doubt that Mr. Lincoln's regard and confidence, which had withstood so much from General McClellan, was giving way. The President had resisted in his behalf for more than a year the earnest and bitter opposition of the most powerful and trusted friends of the Administration. McClellan had hardly a supporter left among the Republican Senators, and few among the most prominent members of the majority in the House of Representatives. In the Cabinet there was the same unanimous hostility to the young general. In the meeting of the 2nd of September, when the President announced that he had placed McClellan in command of the forces in Washington, he was met by an outbreak of protest and criticism from the leading members of the Government, which might well have shaken the nerves of any ruler. But the President stood manfully by his action. He admitted the infirmities of McClellan, his lack of energy and initiative, but for this exigency he considered him the best man in the service, and the country must have the benefit of his talents, although he had behaved badly. We need not refer again to the magnanimity with which the President had overlooked the insolent dispatches of General McClellan from Savage's Station and Harrison's Bar. He closed his ears persistently during all the months of the winter and spring to the stories which came to him from every quarter in regard to the tone of factious hostility to himself which prevailed at McClellan's headquarters. But these stories increased to such an extent during the summer and autumn that even in his mind, so slow to believe evil, they occasioned some trouble. Soon after the battle of Antietam, an incident came to his hearing of which he felt himself obliged to take notice. Major John J. Key, brother to Colonel Thomas M. Key of McClellan's staff, was reported, replying to a question put by a brother officer, why was not the rebel army bagged immediately after the battle near Sharpsburg, to have said, "That is not the game. The object is that neither army shall get much advantage of the other, that both shall be kept in the field till they are exhausted, when we will make a compromise and save slavery." The President sent a letter to Major Key to inform him of this grave charge, and to invite him to disprove it within 24 hours. A few minutes after this notice was sent, the Major appeared at the Executive Mansion in company with Major Levi C. Turner, the officer to whom the remark had been made. A trial, as prompt as those of St. Louis, dispensing justice under the oak at Vincennes, then took place. The President was judge and jury, attorney for the prosecution and for the defense, and he added to these functions that of clerk of the court, and made a record of the proceedings with his own hand, which we copy from his manuscript. At about 11 o'clock a.m., September 27, 1862, Major Key and Major Turner appear before me. Major Turner says, as I remember it, the conversation was, I asked the question why we did not bag them after the battle of Sharpsburg. Major Key's reply was, that was not the game, that we should tire the rebels out and ourselves, that was the only way the Union could be preserved. We come together fraternally, and slavery be saved. On cross-examination, Major Turner says he has frequently heard Major Key converse in regard to the present troubles, and never heard him utter a sentiment unfavorable to the maintenance of the Union. He has never uttered anything which he, Major T., would call disloyalty. The particular conversation detailed was a private one. Upon the reverse of this record, the President made the following indorsement: "In my view, it is wholly inadmissible for any gentleman holding a military commission from the United States to utter such sentiments as Major Key is within proved to have done. Therefore, let Major John J. Key be forthwith dismissed from the military service of the United States." The President's memorandum continues: At the interview of Major Key and Major Turner with the President, Major Key did not attempt to controvert the statement of Major Turner, but simply insisted and tried to prove that he was true to the Union. The substance of the President's reply was that if there was a game even among Union men to have our army not take any advantage of the enemy when it could, it was his object to break up that game. Speaking of the matter afterwards, the President said, "I dismissed Major Key because I thought his silly, treasonable expressions were staff talk, and I wished to make an example." He was still not ready to condemn General McClellan. He determined to give him one more chance. If McClellan, after Antietam, had destroyed the army of Lee, his official position would have been impregnable. If, after Lee had recrossed the Potomac, McClellan had followed and delivered a successful battle in Virginia, nothing could afterwards have prevented his standing as the foremost man of his time. The President, in his intense anxiety for the success of the national arms, would have welcomed McClellan as his own presumptive successor if he could have won that position by successful battle. But the general's inexplicable slowness had at last excited the President's distrust. He began to think, before the end of October, that McClellan had no real desire to beat the enemy. He set in his own mind the limit of his forbearance. He adopted for his guidance a test which he communicated to no one until long afterwards, on which he determined to base his final judgment of McClellan. If he should permit Lee to cross the Blue Ridge and place himself between Richmond and the Army of the Potomac, he would remove him from command. When it was reported in Washington that Lee and Longstreet were at Culpeper Court House, the President sent an order dated the 5th of November to General McClellan, which reached him at Rectortown on the 7th, directing him to report for further orders at Trenton, New Jersey, and to turn the command of the Army of the Potomac over to General Burnside. General C.P. Buckingham delivered his message first to Burnside, and then came with him to McClellan's tent. McClellan says in his memoirs that with the eyes of the two generals upon him, he read the papers with a smile, but when they were gone, he turned to finish a letter he had been writing, and broke out in the heartfelt ejaculation, "Alas for my poor country!" He took credit to himself in after years for not heading a mutiny of the troops. He said, "Many were in favor of my refusing to obey the order and of marching upon Washington to take possession of the government." Thus ended the military career of George Brinton McClellan. Now that the fierce passions of the war, its suspicions and its animosities have passed away, we are able to judge him more accurately and more justly than was possible amid that moral and material tumult and confusion. He was as far from being the traitor and craven that many thought him as from being the martyr and hero that others would like to have him appear. It would be unfair to deny that he rendered, to the full measure of his capacity, sincere and honest service to the Republic. His technical knowledge was extensive, his industry untiring, his private character was pure and upright, his integrity without stain. In the private life to which he retired, he carried with him the general respect and esteem and the affection of a troop of friends, and when by their partiality he was afterwards called to the exercise of important official functions, he adorned every office he held with the highest civic virtues and accomplishments. No one now can doubt his patriotism or his honor, and the fact that it was once doubted illustrates merely the part which the blackest suspicions play in a great civil war, and the stress to which the public mind was driven in the effort to account for the lack of results he gave the country in return for the vast resources which were so lavishly placed in his hands. It was in this native inability to use great means to great ends that his failure as a general lay. It was in his temperament to exaggerate the obstacles in front of him, and this, added to his constitutional aversion to prompt decisions, caused those endless delays which wasted the army, exasperated the country, and gave the enemy unbroken leisure for maturing his plans and constant opportunity for executing them. His lethargy of 6 months in front of Washington, to the wonder and scorn of the Southern generals, his standing at gaze at Yorktown, halted with his vast army by Magruder's men in Buckram, his innocent astonishment at Williamsburg at finding the rebels would not give up Richmond without a fight, his station astride the Chickahominy, waiting for the enemy to grow strong enough to attack him, while his brave soldiers were fading to specters with the marsh fever, his failure to assume the offensive after the Confederate repulse at Seven Pines, his second refusal of the favors of the fortune of war when Lee took his army north of the Chickahominy and Porter fought him all day with little more than one corps, but with splendid courage, his starting for the James in this crisis of his fate, when he should have marched upon Richmond, his final retreat from Malvern Hill to Harrison's Landing, breaking the hearts of the soldiers who had won on that field a victory so complete and so glorious. All these mistakes proved how utterly incapable he was of leading a great army in grand war. No general had ever been offered such wonderful opportunities, and they continued to be offered to him to the end. When Pope had drawn away the enemy from Richmond and given him an unmolested embarkation, and had fought with undaunted valor against Lee's army, before which at last he was forced to give way for want of the relief which he had the right to expect from McClellan, the President, magnanimously ignoring all his own causes of quarrel, gave to McClellan once more his old army reinforced by Pope's, and sent him against an enemy who, in a contempt for his antagonists, acquired in the Peninsula, had crossed the Potomac and then divided his army in half. As a crowning favor of chance, this was made known to McClellan, and even this incalculable advantage he frittered away, and gave Lee 48 hours to call in his scattered battalions. After Antietam, for 6 long weeks of beautiful autumn weather, he lingered on the north bank of the Potomac under the constant pressure of the President's persuasions, and afterwards under the lash of his orders and reproaches, unable to make up his mind to pursue the enemy so long as he could find excuse for delay in a missing shoelace or a broken limber. The devoted affection which he received from his army was strange when we consider how lacking he was in those qualities which generally excite the admiration of soldiers. When Sumner, swinging his hat, charged in front of his lines at Savage's Station, his white hair blowing in the wind; when Phil Kearny, who had lost his bridle arm in Mexico, rode in the storm of bullets with his reins in his teeth, his sword in his right hand, there was something which struck the imagination of their troopers more than far more serious merits would have done. But no one ever saw General McClellan rejoicing in battle. At Williamsburg, the first Peninsular fight, while Hooker and Kearny and Hancock were in the thick of the conflict, he was on the wharf at Yorktown, very busy, doing an assistant quartermaster's duty. The day of Fair Oaks he spent on the north side of the river. When the current of war rolled to the north side at Beaver Dam Creek and Gaines's Mill, he stayed on the south bank. During the retreat to the James, he was far in advance, selecting with his intelligent engineer's eye the spots where Sumner, Franklin, and the rest were to fight their daily battles. And even in the fury and thunder of Malvern Hill, the most splendid feat of arms ever performed by the Army of the Potomac, a sight which a man with the true soldier blood in his veins might give his life to see, he spent the greater part of those glorious hours, the diapason of his greatest victory booming in his ears, in his camp at Haxall's or on board the gunboats, coldly and calmly making his arrangements for the morrow's retreat and the cooperation of the Navy, and at Antietam, the only battle where he really saw his own troops attacking the enemy, he enjoyed that wonderful sight the whole day, says General Palfrey, till towards the middle of the afternoon, when all the fighting was over, on the high ground near Pry's house, where he had some glasses strapped to the fence so that he could look in different directions. We make no imputation on his courage. He was a brave man, but he was too much cumbered with other things to take part in his own battles. With such limitations as these, it is not likely that posterity will rank him among the leading generals of our war. The most his apologists ask for him is a place among the respectable, painstaking officers of the second order of talent, that middle category of meritorious commanders. But when we see such ardent friends and admirers as General Webb and General Palfrey, brought by a conscientious and careful study of his career to such a conviction of his continuous mistakes as they have expressed, we may well conclude that the candid historian of the future will have no sentiment but wonder when he comes to tell the story of his long mismanagement of a great, brave, and devoted army, backed by a government which strained every nerve to support him, and by a people whose fiery zeal would have made him the idol of the nation if he had given them the successes which their sacrifices deserved, and which were a dozen times within his grasp. We have evidence from a candid and intelligent, if not altogether impartial, witness of the impression made upon the peace party of the North by the dismissal of General McClellan from command. Lord Lyons, the British minister at Washington, arrived in New York from a visit to England on the 8th of November, 1862. The Democrats, or the Conservatives, as he called them, had carried the State and elected Mr. Seymour governor. He found them in great exultation over their victory. They imagined that the government would at once desist from the measures which they had denounced as arbitrary or illegal, or if not at once, they were certain that after the 1st of January, when Mr. Seymour would be inaugurated, the government would not dare to exercise its war powers within the limits of the State of New York. They confided to the urbane and genial representative of the British government much more spacious hopes than these, hopes which they were not yet ready to avow to their own countrymen, that the President would seek to terminate the war, not to push it to extremity, that he would endeavor to effect a reconciliation with the people of the South, and renounce the idea of subjugating or exterminating them. But these rising hopes, Lord Lyons says, were dashed by the next day's news. The dismissal of General McClellan caused an irritation not unmixed with consternation and despondency. The general had been regarded as the representative of conservative principles in the army. Support of him had been made one of the articles of the conservative electoral program. His dismissal was taken as a sign that the President had thrown himself entirely into the arms of the extreme radical party, and that the attempt to carry out the policy of that party would be persisted in. The party and the policy referred to were, of course, the Republican party of the nation, and the policy of carrying the war through to the end and saving the Union intact by all the means within the power of the government. And in this forecast, the conservative gentlemen of New York, who sought the accomplished envoy of Great Britain to unbosom to him their joys and their griefs, showed that, however they may have been lacking in patriotism or self-respect, they were not deficient in logic or sagacity. End of chapter 9.